This is part 11 of my series discussing David Deutsch's book, The Beginning of Infinity. BOI says, quote, "The quest for good explanations is, I believe, the basic regulating principle not only of science, but of the Enlightenment generally." And this is one of the themes in the book. And by a good explanation, David means an explanation that is hard to vary. So in this episode, I wanted to talk about the idea of hard to vary and why I have a disagreement with it. I talked with David about it while he was writing the book and expressed my disagreement then, but I did not change his mind. But I'd still like to explain what I think and why. So, first of all, I'm not just saying that he's wrong. My opinion is there are many ways to approach the issue that are roughly equally good, and that hard to vary is one of them, but I don't see it as a special thing that deserves special emphasis. I don't see why it's so important compared to the alternatives. So it doesn't stand out to me as worth focusing so much attention on the way David does. He seems to think that it is a special, especially good idea, and I don't think so. But I don't think it's wrong. I still think it's a correct idea. It's just one correct way of saying it. The basic issue is, what is knowledge? And there are many ways to approach that. And many of them have advantages and disadvantages, so it's good to know a long list of ways to do it, so you can use ones that have advantages that are relevant to whatever you're doing, rather than always using the same one. It's hard to say that any particular way is clearly better. Although if I had to pick one, what I would emphasize is evolution and adaptation. So here are some of the ways you can view knowledge. You can see knowledge as non-arbitrary ideas. You can see it as ideas that break symmetry. You can see knowledge as ideas that survive criticism. You can see knowledge as evolved ideas or adapted ideas. And you can see knowledge as hard to vary ideas. All of these are reasonable approaches. Hard to vary basically just means highly adapted. So it's a different way of repeating what we already knew, which is that knowledge is created by evolution. That's the more fundamental thing going on here. Evolution creates knowledge. Popper's epistemology is an evolutionary epistemology. And then from there, it implies these other things, like that it's hard to vary, because adapted means most variations will make things worse instead of better. It means that evolution's process of random variation and selection, early on in evolution, a random change has a higher chance to be a benefit. And then the more evolved something gets, the more chance that a random change will make it worse, not better, because it's already made a lot of the good changes that are easy to randomly happen upon. So evolution adapts an idea to a goal or a problem, which makes it non-arbitrary. And it can be an idea in a mind, or it can be the knowledge in a gene, which you may or may not want to use the word idea for, but it's the same kind of issue. Anyway, adapted traits have reasons for being the specific way that they are, which makes them hard to vary because you screw up the reason if you just randomly changed around. A random thing is much less likely to have a reason that it works well that way. Adapting an idea also makes it survive criticism better, since it's more correct. Random ideas are going to be wrong a lot, whereas if you actually have something that's correct, most random changes will make it worse. There are a lot more ways to be wrong than there are to be right, so randomness just by itself is an enemy of correctness if you've gotten something correct. So it's hard to vary in that a bunch of random changes will probably make it worse, not better. So the important thing to understand is, what does critical rationalism say about knowledge? Which is, it's created by evolution, and you need to conceptually understand how that works, why evolution creates knowledge. And then if you know what knowledge is in that way, then it opens up many good ways to think about it. So one I thought of is the symmetry breaking view of knowledge. So imagine you don't know anything, and there are tons of random or arbitrary ideas. It's just kind of this chaos of many, many ideas. It could even be all possible ideas. And you have this set of ideas to deal with, but you haven't yet figured out in any way which ones are good or bad. So some of them disagree with each other. There are conflicts and contradictions between the ideas. So how do you resolve these disagreements and start making progress on figuring out which ideas are better or worse? Which ones make sense? Which ones are knowledge? Which ones are crap? So when two ideas conflict with each other, the default is either one could be wrong. It is a symmetric situation. X contradicts Y means Y contradicts X. The contradiction goes both ways symmetrically. So when you see symmetry like that, you see these two things conflict, and I have no idea which one's right. That is a lack of knowledge. You don't have the answer. You don't know what's good. And then what is knowledge? What is getting knowledge? It means breaking the symmetry, figuring out a reason to prefer one idea over another. Taking that conflict that looked symmetric and finding out something that makes it look asymmetric, so you can say, well, this idea is good and that one's bad, and here's my reason. So that is just another way of thinking about knowledge. Just like hard to vary is one way of thinking about knowledge. So if you have an idea and you prefer it for a reason, then it's harder to vary because there's something good about it. So if you vary the part that's good, you'll mess it up. All the views on knowledge pretty much amount to the same thing. It's always about evolution and adaptation. So it's good to understand a lot of different views, and the core central idea here is evolution, not hardness to vary, and not asymmetry either. My own idea is not central, it's just one of the ways you can look at it. Another issue with hard to vary is, what does it really mean? Let's look at it in a bit more detail. So one of the questions is hard to vary given what constraints? Because if there are no constraints, you can vary anything to anything in one step. You just say, my step is, instead of that, I replace it with this other thing. And you can replace anything with absolutely anything, and so everything is equally easy to vary and can be varied to any other thing, and it doesn't work that way. So you need some constraints, like what variations are allowed, what variations are considered successful. And the basic answer is an idea has to be hard to vary while still solving the same problem or set of problems, or a similar set of problems. Often the variations solve some slightly different problems. Maybe they're a little bit better, maybe a little worse, sometimes things get worse. But the basic idea is you want to change it, and it still accomplishes the same purpose or goal as before, and it hasn't been broken. So you're finding different variants of the idea that are not broken and still work for the same purpose, and then how easy is it to do that? But you run into problems like you need to solve approximately the same problem as before. How similar does it have to be to still count, and how do you measure similarity? That's hard if you want to be rigorous. It'd be hard to do it in terms of math. Defining what changes or variations is hard. What is a small variation versus just replacing it with an arbitrary different idea? Measuring or defining hardness is hard. You say hard to vary, but how do you define how hard to do something is? It could easily be taken as referring to your skill level. If you're more skilled, it's easier to vary ideas because you're more creative. But how good an idea is, whether it's knowledge, shouldn't depend on your skill level. So there's a bunch of difficulties to address with how hard to vary works. You can try to define it using random variations. You say, you make random changes and then see how often the idea is broken or not. But random change algorithms are actually themselves a tricky area. There are many different ways to make random changes. People often talk about it like just change it randomly, like that means a specific well-defined thing. There's a particular algorithm that it refers to, but that is incorrect. One of the many algorithms it could refer to is just take the set of all possible ideas and pick one at random and vary it to that. But if you use that one, David's idea doesn't work well. He needs variations that are similar in some way, so we need partially random changes. And it's hard to define partially random changes. One of the things you might want to do is look at many variation algorithms, and then is the idea hard to vary using most of the algorithms? But it's hard to get a good sample and decide that your sample is representative of possible variation algorithms. And you maybe don't want to be representative of all logically possible variation algorithms, but only of certain good or reasonable ones. Anyways, David presents hard to vary as a simple idea. He tries to present it as a thing you can just grasp pretty easily and use it in your life, and it's not that hard, and it's more like a slogan or soundbite than a detailed, complicated thing that you leave to the experts. It's meant to be approachable, accessible to everyone. But it is actually super complicated if you want to go into detail and really know what it means and use it in detail. So BOI does not cover the details. It doesn't teach you how to actually use this thing. It doesn't even express what some of the difficulties are. And based on our conversations, I don't think that DD has rigorous answers to all the questions that I've been talking about on this slide. That's not the worst thing. Like, epistemology is a hard field, and I think hard to vary is a reasonable thing to say and talk about. Like, I'm not saying we don't have all the answers, so it's worthless. I'm saying we don't have all the answers, so don't overestimate it. Don't think that he's presented this simple, elegant truth and made everything easy for you, and now you're super wise or something. Like, it's actually a tricky topic, and the details are hard, and if you really want to know about it, you have to study it and stuff, and hard to vary is a bit superficial, in addition to not being unique. And presenting it as unique seemed weird to me. So, the idea of hard to vary doesn't improve on Popper. It's not adding some significant new thing that Popper didn't tell us. David also emphasizes explanation. I agree explanation is important, but so did Popper. Popper wrote quite a bit about it himself. David does have good things to say about it, and one of them that Popper did not say is the predictive oracle example in Fabric of Reality, Chapter 1. I really liked that example. I think it's worth reading. If you've read BOI, but you have not read Fabric of Reality, Chapter 1, I would definitely recommend it. I think that might be the best chapter David wrote. I liked it. Anyway, David used the word explanation 430 times in Fabric and 658 times in BOI. So in Fabric, it comes up every 325 words. Like, one word out of every 325 on average is the word explanation. Or explanations, like plural, would also have come up in my search. And in BOI, it's every 280 words, so it's a little more often. Popper, by contrast, I checked him. In Logic of Scientific Discovery, he wrote the word explanation every 4,847 words, not as often. And Conjectures and Refutations, it was every 2,012 words, and in World of Parmenides, it was every 1,376 words. So there's an upward trend that's noticeable, that in his older book, Popper wrote the word explanation less often, and then in the middle book, it was more often, and then in the more recent book, it was even more often. There's an upward trend, which then continues with David's books, which use it even more frequently than Popper's books. So I think David emphasizes explanation more than Popper, and he wrote about it at a higher frequency. But on the other hand, he wrote fewer books. So my guess is, overall, Popper talked about it more. So I don't think there's a major contribution there. Popper said a lot about it. On the other hand, in a recent academic paper, David tried to take credit for it and say how he was adding this significant thing about explanation being important. And I thought that was unfair to Popper, who also knew about explanation, said a lot about it. And I will talk about that in my next video, which is going to be primarily about how BOI has a bunch of misquotes and will be the end of the series. So, main points from this video. Knowledge is created by evolution, which adapts information to purposes or goals or problems, which are all the same kind of thing. And it does that in a context, also called an environment, or a situation. So this is the basic major point that critical rationalism claims, one of them at least. And it implies that knowledge is hard to vary, is non-arbitrary, has asymmetries, is good at surviving criticism, and other things. And all of those things are contextual. The same thing can work in one context and not another. Anyways, and hard to vary is complicated, so it shouldn't be seen as this unique, simple slogan that's so wonderful. It is just one idea of many. It's pretty good. It's hard to be rigorous with. So I think some people overestimate it. Explanations are important. We don't just need predictions. We need reasoning and understanding. We need to understand why and how. And that is a significant theme of critical rationalism, including David Deutsch's work. And I agree with that. I think it's important. So if you like this, you can read my articles and sign up for my emails at my Critical Fallibilism website, www.criticalfallibilism.com.